Hi, this is obviously the fourth in the series of 8 PowerPoint slides or sets of PowerPoint slides talking about preparing for your dissertation as part of the research you'll be doing for your MBA dissertation, your MBA Educational Leadership dissertation. So this one's going to be talking about researcher positionality. And the previous set of slides I was talking about the relationship between you as a researcher and the research data and the way in which you analyze the data. So we're going to talk now about research positionality, which is a key part of your determining your research design and also the way in which you write up your chapter on research. So far we looked at the discourse on how to define research focus, what areas you decided to do could be answered. We looked at primary and secondary data, we looked at paradigms, we're now looking at the role of a researcher, okay? So we will go on and do those two things now, or three things now. So where are you in the research process? And you have a relationship to what's going on as the researcher. So both the research and the participants have the potential to impact on the research process. Your job is to recognize where you are liable to make an impact and what that impact could be and whether it actually changes the data or influences the data and or the findings. Okay, so the identities come into play via our perceptions, but also by the way in which other people expect us or perceive us. Now, typical in the MBA is that someone, as a student on the MBA, is actually in a senior leadership role somewhere in the education system, and the relationship to those people they want to investigate is often one where there is some sort of power relationship. Sometimes it's an upward power relationship. More often than not, it's either an equal or downward relationship. In other words, you're talking to people in a role of researcher where you are actually also a colleague, and that can influence the way in which people react to you. We also carry with us our own set of potential for bias, in other words, how we see the world. And we're going to use some big words very soon, and they all end in the word ology, which decide how we see the world, how we have knowledge of the world, and what we believe and value. Okay, now those make us unique as an individual, but they influence the way in which we see other people and the way in which other people see us. So a key part of your success as a researcher is to recognize your own potential for bias, okay, and how you can actually get to hear or understand what other people are saying rather than what you want to hear or the way in which you would interpret it only from your perception. You're trying to interpret the world from their perception, not yours. Now, you can't be neutral, you have an influence. And what we're trying to do is not only to recognize the potential for influence, but also how you might deal with it. So, understanding the world, okay? This is a quotation from a very famous book that's got nothing to do with research, okay? And I'll take you through the quotation. You cannot see what I see because you see what you see. Now, think hard as we go through this. You cannot see what I see because you see what you see. So, in other words, if we're trying to understand someone else, we've got to recognize they might be seeing different things to us, even though we think they're the same thing. If you think that's not likely, ask yourself why it is you often have a row, an argument with the person who's closest to you emotionally in life. It's often because you think you're seeing one thing and they think they're seeing another. Okay? You understand a certain circumstance from your perception, they're understanding it from a different perception. Now that happens to the people you love the most in the world. Imagine what it's like when you're trying to do research with people you're only coming across in a fleeting manner. So first of all, you can't see what I see because you see what you see. Secondly, you cannot know what I know because you know what you know. Okay? Now think about that. The example I use most of all is people who are keen on, say, the use of digital devices in education are often quite keen on the equipment themselves. And they get flummoxed when someone doesn't have an understanding of the equipment. I mean, imagine if you're used to touchscreen technology and you're used to using, I don't know, Twitter or WhatsApp or something, and you come across someone who's still using a Nokia phone from the 1990s. They have no concept of what you're talking about, and you can't understand why they don't understand. So you cannot know what I know because you know what you know. What I see and what I know cannot be added to what you know because they're not of the same kind. Okay? And the last bit of this quotation, neither can it replace what you see and know because that will be able to replace you yourself. Now the citation there is something quite strange and shows a bit of my world. It's from Douglas Adams, and it's one of the ever increasingly badly named trilogy of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. In other words, it's a futurist fantasy. Very clever. Very sadly, Douglas Adams died at a very young age, and I think eventually there were 5 books in the series. And this one is about him finding a philosopher who told him that he can't understand the world as I understand it because you're not me. And if you were understanding it, that would actually replace you. So it's worth knowing that people have different perceptions, people see things differently, and people don't know what you know. Okay? So the 3 ologies I talked about are ontology, axiology, and epistemology. Now, they are frustratingly long words and difficult words, but I think really, if you can learn to deal with them by doing a simple transition from what ontology means, reality. Your ontology is your understanding of the world. That's your understanding, your reality, okay? So, for example, and this is a very current example, you cannot understand what is driving or motivating the outgoing President of the United States. It's because you have a completely different view of the world to the one he has, okay? Axiology equals values, okay? All of us have an implicit value space, or it may be explicit. It depends very much on where you come from. For example, if you're a member of the Catholic faith, then your axiology, your beliefs are shaped very much by the Catholic Church. So if you see the word ontology and go, reality, if you see the word axiology and go, values, do the same with epistemology, and the substitute word is knowledge. And you have certain amounts of knowledge which you carry with you. And your persons or people you are talking to may have similar knowledge, or they may have different knowledge. And you've got to reconcile those ontologies, axiology and epistemology in yourself as a researcher. Recognize where you're coming from and say, does it influence the way in which I see the data, the way in which I understand what's going on? Okay, so that philosophical alignment which brings together ontology, axiology and epistemology is where you as a human being exist. And it's very rare that you're going to find everybody has exactly the same or anywhere near your philosophical alignment, because you are unique and they are unique. But the point I'm trying to get to is you have to recognize how your world, your understanding of the world, how your knowledge base and your set of values and belief can actually affect the way in which you both collect data and the way in which you would analyze data. And we've got to find a way for you to recognize who you are and what you might bring to the table when you're trying to understand something from research. Okay? So let's take an assumption. Right? And I said assumptions can make us think that everything is obvious. And assumptions there, when you are surprised, you have to explain something. Okay? Imagine trying to explain to someone who'd never seen touchscreen technology what touchscreen technology is. You're shocked that you'd have to explain it. It's like saying, what's a wristwatch? Well, everybody knows what a wristwatch is, but the chances are they might not know. And there are things that are appearing these days where people aren't as highly skilled or knowledgeable. And the world is changing so fast that things can go past you so quickly. So, to understand a culture, look to see what its underlying assumptions are. What's driving these people? What happens to say this is how they actually understand the world? And is it unconscious and learned, okay, or is it conscious and learned? So taken for granted assumptions are powerful because they're less debatable than those that are espoused. And so people might understand and believe things without ever questioning why they understand or believe it. So the point I'm making is, in trying to understand the data, in trying to establish the data, you have to be prepared to recognize that people may not have a clue what you're talking about, or you may be influencing in many ways what they are going to do. Okay? So the key conceptual issues to work to wear with here are subjectivity versus objectivity. Subjectivity means people are entitled to a view. Objectivity means you clarify that and make it hard. Okay, now there is a point in qualitative inquiry when you can turn something that's subjective into an objective outcome. For example, if everyone says, yeah, that's what we think, then you've got an objective outcome. But if you've got a difference of opinion, you have to recognize that. You've got the notion of insider and outsider researcher, and the potential for bias, which I've just talked about, which is inherent because we understand the world in certain ways. Now, once again, at this point, I'd recommend you take a break, think about the way in which you construct your world, and think about somebody who may not understand the world the same way as you, and how you've had disagreements in the past that are based on simple misunderstandings or an expectation or an assumption that you had about certain things. Okay? So that collectively together is called positionality. And this is where you describe yourself as the researcher and the way in which you could influence the data, both in collecting it and in interpreting it. And then finally, with the positionality, we've got to find a way in which you can say what you've done to reduce the influence you have on that data. So let's start from the point of view is, why would people want to talk to you? And as a practitioner becoming a researcher, if you're researching your colleagues, you have to ask the question, why would people want to talk to me? Okay? And what will they say is often influenced by who they think you are. So I've turned up at a school in the past and I'm the professor from the university. And people are trying to, in some way, impress me with the way in which they behave. Me, I just want to hear what they've got to say, but they can't get past the fact that I'm from the university. And actually, the higher the rank the university, the more they are sort of like this. So people's willingness to talk to you is influenced by who they think you are. If you're, for example, closely related to them as a colleague, they may not want to tell you certain things because they might think you're going to use it against them. I've come across that in some parts of the world, particularly in the Gulf countries, where people are not willing to talk because they think it might be in some way used to judge them. Okay, so if people are willing to talk to you, it's because they think they can do so without damaging themselves. So, what's the issue about outsider versus insider? Well, the outsider suggests that you're a neutral outsider who can actually watch what's going on because you are distanced and detached from the subjects of the research. Obviously, this has advantages, okay? That you can look at something and see it and not be influenced by the local culture, okay, or by previous information. The insider is exactly the opposite. You can understand things better because you work inside the organization, the system that you are inquiring into. So the insider doctrine is where you think you understand things. The outsider is where you have no previous experience of them. My guess is that most of you will probably be working with systems you understand and know, so in some way you're going to be an insider in terms of your research. The quality and the quantity of your insiderness, if you can have such a word, is yet to be established, but most of you probably have the insider doctor, will work with you an insider. So insider research gives you great opportunity because you're familiar with it, you've got a rapport with people going on, you've got opportunity for access, you're less intrusive. In some way you can get to it, and also data collection is less time consuming, you don't have traveling involved, you've got greater flexibility working with people. On the other hand, it bumps into where research stops and the rest of your life begins. When are you the researcher? When are you the other person? Okay, and again, it's not often I come across this in the MBA students in the past, that they are working with colleagues and they try very hard to be the researcher, but before they know where they are, they've reverted to colleague. So the insider research has benefits, but it has some drawbacks. So your positionality is in part you being reflexive. And what we mean by being reflexive is to look at yourself, undertake self-scrutiny, and be self-conscious of the relationship between you and another. Okay, so the positionality is to determine that you understand who you are and what impact you could have on any situation. What you're going to do about it is a second order issue. But in the first order, when you're writing up your research and when you're preparing your research, you've got to be prepared that you have some way influenced the data collection and the data analysis. So identify what you bring to the table. And then when you're investigating something, these terms you may want to use the emic and the etic perspective. The emic perspective is where you can get inside something, okay? And this is where you can represent the participant's viewpoint fairly. This is called the emic perspective. You've actually got inside the organization and you've been able to actually, or the system or the whatever it is, the structure, and you understand the world from their point of view. A very good piece of research that was done very many years ago was conducted by someone called Nell Dunn, who was almost a journalist, and she lived with a group of young people in a suburb of London which was called Clapham, and the book was called Up the Junction because the famous railway station in Clapham is Clapham Junction, and she lived with them and became part of that group for very many months, almost a year, I think, and therefore she began to understand their social mores, their behaviours, the rules by which they operated, and could be considered to be really having an understanding, having the emic perspective. Okay, a very poor piece of research that was done in a similar mode was by a woman who investigated what was going on in Western Samoa, which is an island in the Pacific, and the attitudes and behaviours of young women in Western Samoa, and made a judgment as to what was their thinking and why they were thinking that way and what could be anticipated. And it turned out that the researcher didn't understand these people at all, and the Western Samoan young women were making stories up to try and satisfy her need for gathering data. So that was a researcher called Margaret Mead, and the Western Samoan women and the sexual attitudes of Western Samoan women, and she never really understood them because she never really got to know them or lived their experience. So although she tried to establish an insider viewpoint, she couldn't. She didn't establish the emic perspective. The etic perspective is where you get outside and to get that viewpoint and translate it and understand it from an outside perspective rather than an insider perspective. So if we go back to Nell Dunn and her work on Up the Junction, what she then did was to be able to stand back metaphorically and write what this meant as a social setting in a world where she was no longer a part of it, and she was translating it into a world where other people would understand the social mores and behaviour of that young group of people. That's the etic perspective. You can see a close parallel here between insider and outsider. Okay, so your job as a researcher is to be able to report what you've seen and favourably try and understand it from the emic perspective as close as you can, and then get it into the etic perspective. What does it mean in relation to the rest of the world? So the etic perspective allows you, the researcher, to make conceptual and theoretical sense of the case. Okay? So that's what you're aiming to do when you're trying to get inside and understand something, is to step back outside and say, what does it mean in relation to what we know in the world in terms of concepts and theory? So at that point we stop on this one and leave you to think about that, because the positionality issue will become relevant, as I keep saying, and I have said it several times, in terms of determining how you establish and create the data collection and how you deal with the data when you've got it. So this is a bit which we will deal with in terms of the consequences of that on another occasion, but that's the end of this set of PowerPoint slides. Now I'm stopping for today, so the next time you see me I'll probably be hopefully in a different set of clothes. Okay, bye for now.